because the book is written from the point of view of a child, and looking back, from an adult looking back as a child, that I'm finding that so many of the younger people can identify with my character, not just because of a racial difference, but of one of feeling left out or not belonging.
Okay. Welcome to the Gladys Waddingham Lecture Hall of the Englewood Public Library. We're really fortunate today to have as a special guest speaker Ms. Jeanne Wakatsuki Houston, an author, but mainly known for her book, Farewell to Manzanar, as many of you have read it. This public library program was funded through a grant through Cal Humanities, formerly known as the California Council for the Humanities, and in partnership with the California Center for the Book. Okay. This project year, there'll be programming going on, started last month, March through November, and the theme is California Reads, Searching for Democracy. We have with us here today from Cal Humanities, Los Angeles office, Felicia Kelly, Senior Program Officer, Tonya Jones, Program Associate. Mary Menzel is with the California Center for the Book. She'll be interviewing the author. And a personal thank you to our staff here, Ms. Bree Weber, our library assistant, Mike Easley, our senior administrative analyst who helped with the reports and crunched the numbers. Okay, Fran?
Thank you, Kay. Kay Acuda organized everything. I'm Frances Track, the acting library manager, and I welcome everybody, and I'm really excited that we have this wonderful program, and it gives me great pleasure now to welcome Ms. Anne Cheek-LaRose, who's going to be representing Councilwoman Judy Dunlap, and also you are an art commissioner. So,
thank you. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II was one of the saddest points in the history of our country. All across the LA, families were ripped from their homes, given 48 hours to pack, to sell their belongings, and to move or be removed to an alien world, Manzanar. Farewell to Manzanar is the story of a 7-year-old girl and her family. It's not a unique story. Thousands of other people experienced the very same thing. What is unique is that this woman had the courage to tell the story. She wrote it in 1973, and the book has been taught as a history lesson to children and read by adults of all ages over the years. In 1976, NBC made it into a television movie, and it received the prestigious Humanities Award. Please help me welcome warmly the author, Jeanne Wakatsuki Houston.
I'm so glad you could all be with us today. I'll just explain the format. I am going to be in conversation with Mrs. Houston for a while. We're going to have a lot of time for your questions, because I'm sure I'll forget to ask her something that you'd like to know. This conversation is part of California Reads, which is part of a statewide read. It's part of an even bigger initiative from Cal Humanities called Searching for Democracy. I really encourage you all to go to the Cal Humanities website, calhum.org, because it's a beautifully redesigned website that will tell you where events and activities of all kinds are over this coming year as we get into the election season. As I said, we're going to leave plenty of time for your questions today, but Mrs. Houston and I were both a little curious when we heard that students were going to be in the audience to know whether you've already read the book. Is that a nod?
Let's see your hands. Who's read the book?
Who's read? Let's have everybody who's read the book raise their hand so the kids don't feel out of it. Okay, just so we know. And actually, thank you for that brief overview of what Mrs. Houston was writing about. I know it's hard for us to believe. I guess that's the first thing I want to ask you, Jeanne. Over the 30 years that you've been visiting schools and libraries to talk about this book, what has the reaction been of kids? And has that reaction changed over the 30 years?
No, it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed. I think that, first of all, there has to be a lot of explaining done about, the laws during the time and so forth, about the Constitution and why this was such a affront to our Constitution. That's part of my speaking, is to educate on that level. But I think that because the book is written from the point of view of a child, and looking back, from an adult looking back as a child, that I'm finding that so many of the younger people can identify with my character, not just because of a racial difference, but of one of feeling left out or not belonging, or I mean, I've had thousands of letters. I mean, of course, this is like over a span of 30 some odd years. And so many children will write, well, I've always felt left out because I'm fat, and I felt different. Or my father drank too, and your story helped me. So anyway, it's been a very interesting journey from the beginning of writing the book and hearing results. Hearing the result of other people reading the book, and it still does touch children.
Now, can you tell us what your personal connection is with Englewood?
Oh, yes. Well, I was born here. I'm probably right under where the airport is right now. That used to be strawberry fields and farms. And at the time, my father, he did very many things, like he was a fisherman, a lawyer, all these types of activities that he did. But at the time I was born, he had a farm. And I think they were raising string beans, maybe some strawberries, right where the airport is now. So on my birth certificate it says, born in Englewood, California. So this is my second visit here. In the last 6 months, I was at El Camino College, and it really was kind of a homecoming again, I hadn't been back here for these many years.
And I think you've lived several places around California. Can you give us an idea?
Yes,
Yeah.
okay. Well, I was born in Englewood, then we lived in Ocean Park. My father was a fisherman after he was a farmer. And we lived in Ocean Park, Venice, where Ocean Park is now. And actually at the time of the outbreak of the war, we were probably the only Japanese family living in Ocean Park. And so we were racially isolated. So my father was picked up by the FBI just the day after Pearl Harbor. I mean, he just disappeared. So my mother and said, well, we need to be with other Japanese families. So then we moved to Terminal Island, which was a fishing ghetto. I mean, Terminal Island is now a Navy base, but at one time it was a fishing ghetto where Japanese families lived, and the men fished for the fishing canneries, like Van de Kamp or French's. Just like sharecropping, but it was share fishing. So we moved there, and then that's where we stayed. Moved again to Boyle Heights, so that the family would stay together when they realized that we were being interned, that we were being gathered together and interned someplace. And so from Ocean Park and Venice area to San Pedro or Terminal Island, Boyle Heights, and then Manzanar. and then after back to Long Beach. So does that answer the question?
Gosh, and then the Central
of course,
Coast,
after
right?
that, it was up north. Then I went to San Jose State, and my family raised strawberries in San Jose, so San Jose State. I live in Santa Cruz now, which is up north. So I'm definitely a California girl.
Yeah. And tell us a little bit about your co-author, your late husband, who unfortunately isn't with us anymore.
Yes. Well, I met Jim at college in 1956. And at that time, San Jose State had 10,000 students. And it just so happened that we both were majoring in journalism and minoring in Spanish. So therefore, we had every class together, and we were the only two. I mean, I guess it was karma or fate that we had every class together. And then when we began, quote, dating, in those days, there wasn't interracial, dating at all. We were the only interracial couple on campus at that time, that are dating. And so Jim was a San Francisco boy, born in San Francisco, and he also went to school in Texas, Abilene Christian College in Texas, and then he went to Pepperdine before he came up to San Jose State. And then we were married in Hawaii in 1957, and we were married for 57 years before he passed away 3 years ago. So it's a long relationship and filled with many quote verses. Thank you. That was a sweet question about Jim.
Well, I know that he was an accomplished author and
Oh,
a
yeah.
really respected teacher at various places
Yes.
in California.
Yeah, he taught at Stanford, taught at UCSC, and in fact, maybe I could tell the story of how Farewell to Manzanar began, because it was co-authored with my husband. And even though I majored in journalism and wanted someday to be, quote, a writer, it just wasn't in the cards. First of all, there were no Asian women, Asian American women writers. No one, you never saw anybody we didn't even have television then, that you'd have the newscasters who are usually, that's where the first break came for Asian American women on television, was as newscasters. No television at the time. So anyway, Jim and I had every class together. And one day, and this was after we have 3 children, and my nephew, who had been born in the camps, for those of you who've read it, there's a few pages, a chapter where my oldest sister goes in on Christmas Day, and then she's in very hard labor and is very hard birth, and 2 days later she gives birth. And this son, her son, so he grew up, and he was at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and this was in 71, and he came over one day to visit in Santa Cruz, and he said, "Auntie," he said, I'm taking this sociology class, and for the first time, the teacher mentioned Manzanar, mentioned, some camps in Manzanar. He says, I was born there. I was born in Manzanar. He says, I don't know anything about it. What can you tell me about it? And so I said, oh, well, don't you ask your parents? And he said, yeah, I've asked my mother, who was my oldest sister, and he said, but they seem very reluctant to talk about it. It's as if I am doing something wrong by asking them about Manzanar. So I just thought I would come to ask you, Auntie, what was Manzanar about? So I just kind of just smiled and said, oh, sure, I'll tell you about Manzanar. And I began telling him in the same way, about the, bad food, and just jokingly about what the camp was like. So stories that we told if the family got together. And we talked about camp. We just talked joke, stories, funny stories. So I did that. Now, Gary, he just sat there and looked at me, and he said, Auntie, this is a kid of the 60s. He's been through the 60s. So he's watching me, he says, Auntie, he says, you're talking about being in a prison camp, because that's what it was, as if it was nothing, as if it was some summer camp. He said, how did you feel about that? And he emphasized the word feel. And that was the first time anybody ever asked me how I felt. And it also was the first time that I allowed myself to feel. And maybe it was really the time had come that I was able to do that. And so I did. And I just burst into tears. And I couldn't speak. And I couldn't help myself. I couldn't stop crying. I was just almost hysterical. And my poor nephew thought, oh my God, what have I done to my auntie? What have I done to put her into this hysterics? And I just said, well, look, Gary, I can't seem to talk about this. I was shocked myself at my own reaction. I said, but I'll write something for the family. And so it was left at that. So I had experience writing. I studied writing. And so I we lived by the beach. I'd go down the beach and sit and try to write. And I found I was mostly in tears most of the time. So I was having this kind of weird breakdown. So my husband, Jim, was teaching writing, creative writing in English, well, actually just creative writing, up at UC Santa Cruz, University of California at Santa Cruz at the time. And so one day I said to him, say, Jim, I wonder if you could help me with this writing project you're on. He said, what project? And so I explained to him. And Jim and I at that point had been married 14, 15 years, and I knew him 5 years before that. And he never knew about Manzanar. I had never told him. He knew about some camp in my background because that's how it was. Oh yeah, there was this camp. But it never just sunk in his, he just never explored it further. And so I told him, I was emotionally honest for the first time, honest, with a lot of tears, and told him what I felt, what had happened, and it just all came out. And he was astonished. And he said, oh my God, he said, I've known you all these years and never realized you were carrying that around with you. He said, and it's not something just for your family. He said, this is a story that should be read by every American in this country. He said, so let's write it together. And that began the collaboration, which took about a year. And what we did was, in those days, they didn't have little tape recorders. They had the big reel, the reels like that. So we taped my memories, and my sisters, and anybody in the family who would speak about it, because there was a reluctance at first. And then we also corroborated the interviews with any researcher in the libraries. And what we discovered was that there were books written about the internment. They were written by white scholars, and they were all in the stacks of some libraries. So they weren't any stories that were told by internees themselves, from the human point of view, or the experiential point of view. So that, thank God for Jim, who is a terrific writer, and he realized this is the way this story has to be told, from this human point of view, and what the consequences of, on a child, in that it could stay with you throughout your life, and yet not be talked about. And I learned a lot from that, doing not only the interviewing with Jim, but we just realized that post-traumatic stress syndrome, you see, that term did not come up until the 80s. And actually, I was writing a book with a Vietnam vet at the time who was suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome of the, being in the war. But in actual fact, all of us, if we've had any kind of extreme physical, emotional experience, I mean, it could be, death of a loved one, death of a parent, rape. I mean, any traumatic experience in your life, is recorded in your brain, and your brain holds it there and saves it there because you survived it. And anything you survive, your brain wants to hang on to just in case you need it again, so that you can lump out it. We're just very survival beings. So post-traumatic, they realized that's what post-traumatic stress syndrome was, so that if you had an experience like the GIs did, and then they would be walking across the street and they would have a smell of gardenia or something that reminded them of Vietnam, and they would go into, they'd have a flashback. Well, if all of us have flashbacks of different degree, and I think the reason why the internment story was not told earlier than when, in a, quote, popular way, in a readable way for everyone, is that we suffered post-traumatic stress syndrome. The whole community, the whole group of us did, and we just didn't want to talk about it. It just was something that, and I think that you'll find, and I'm going to say this, and I don't usually don't like to even put the Holocaust experience and what happened to the Japanese in the same breath, because they're totally different. One was a death experience. However, it is true that many of the Holocaust survivors, these are the people who survived the Holocaust, could not talk about it. I mean, it was so horrendous anyway, it would be hard to talk about it. But it's that type of thing, whereas their children, or someone who, on the outer side, who may have experienced the result of what had happened to their parents or someone in the Holocaust, then they acted out. They acted out the wounds, and and they had to have therapy and so forth. I mean, this I think is a fact that's well known. So it became clear to me at this time that the person experiencing it, is not the only one that suffers the experience. Everybody around does, because it just, that's how it works, That's why we're all connected. So getting back to the writing of the book, and we did discover that about the post-traumatic stress syndrome, and writing, and then finished the book. And at first, when it was sent to an agent in New York, this agent read it and said, "Well, this book could never get published." He said, there's just too much hard feelings about the Japanese. He said they're just competing with us so strongly in the some industry. What is it? With the fabric industry. He says, so there's all kinds of bad, they have a bad reputation right now. So even the agent could not make the difference, the distinction between Japanese in Japan and Japanese Americans. So Jim just dropped that agent immediately, and then it was published, eventually by San Francisco Book Company. So how am I doing? Am I really off? Because
That's okay. I love when you just go where you want to go.
Yeah, and so this is about, and I think it just started out about me being born here in Englewood, and then the family, living in different places in California, and that I now live in Santa Cruz. And most of my family that are still living live in Long Beach, Oxnard, and San Jose.
Well, and I think it's so interesting what you're talking about with the post-traumatic stress, because one of the questions we have, even as adult readers of Farewell to Manzanar, not just, student readers, why did you have this sense of shame? Why weren't you filled with rage the whole time? Why did you go? Why did you just go when they told you to go? I think people are more radicalized now, and it's hard for them to understand the mindset that you portray so well as, you internalizing this guilt and this shame just for being Japanese, for no other reason. And also, these days, what we all want, right, is our 15 minutes of fame, right? Something happens to us and we phone up the media and we want to talk about it and we want our picture out there. And so I think it's hard now sometimes for young people these days to understand. Your nephew comes to you and says, I have never heard you talk about this thing that I've now learned is this really big thing that happened in our country.
Well, I think we have to go back and really understand that racism against Asians on the West Coast began 100 years before the internment. So there was great anti-Asian feelings. I mean, there were laws that you could not, my father, for instance, could not become a citizen, and he could not own land. There was at the time when Asians could not own land in California. So it was 100 years of racism and prejudice before the actual internment of the Japanese Americans. So it was like the culmination. And that's what we have to be aware of, and that's why we study these things. That's why it's good for you students to understand this, that if you don't deal with these problems that seem odd or they can just blow up into something huge later on. And so it was not like the beginning of racist feelings towards Asians. It was the culmination of 100 years of anti-Asian laws and attitude in the state of California and all up the West Coast. That's because this is where the Asians were. They were not on the West Coast or in the Middle West.
Well, but I think, too, what's always shocking to me is when you remind me of the proportion of the Japanese Americans who were interned, who were native born to America, citizens. It is not just people like your father who were born in Japan, who were, I suppose you could see that they were, somehow allied with the enemy or something.
Yes, and that's why it's so important to remember. It was 75%, 72%
that's
were
amazing.
native-born American, or were American citizens born in Hawaii, and so forth. So that is why we know it was a racist act. It was not about your citizenship. It was about, do you look like the enemy?
Sure.
You see? And so, and think of it. The United States is one of the only democratic nations in the world that is so multicultural, multiracial. And we are a democracy. So it's so important that we uphold these laws that protect all of us, because our whole nation, our whole, history, it depends on that. Because we are a multicultural, multiracial nation. I mean, what other country in the world is a democracy of that? Maybe Australia? No, but Australia is a monarchy, aren't they? I mean, they're not a monarchy. But can anybody think of any other country? So we are essentially an experiment. I mean, I like to think of us as an experiment. I like to say to people in their communities that live, with different people, say, hey, you are an experiment. I mean, where else in this globe can all these different people live together and get along and share your differences and see that your differences are valuable? That, in other words, we don't all want to be the same, right? The differences is what makes us rich, culturally rich.
Well, and I love you always have a very optimistic view of our country and our democracy, because in your view, yes, Manzanar and the other camps were an affront to our democracy and our Constitution, but that it was put right. Eventually it was put right. So you have a pretty positive view of the American experiment, and you've managed to hold on to that view, as the decades go by, and you see other things happening in our history, good and bad.
Well, we're not perfect.
No?
But we work toward a perfect union. And I think this really would hit home when my husband and I traveled to the East and Southeast Asian countries. And we took the film and we spoke, at the universities there at different groups. And I had two interesting experiences. First was in the Philippines. And we were speaking at the University of the Philippines to a big group of kids, and we had showed the films, and they speak English very well there. So we had this conversation. Now, I don't know if any of you know or have been to the Philippines or know the racial and cultural mix in the Philippines. Well, anyway, it's very. They must have 100 different languages and different groups. So in this class, someone raised their hand after the talk, and they said, that's all well and good about your film and your book, but what did the real Americans think about it? This is a student, because they had acquired our prejudices over there. And so I thought for a minute, and my husband was like stunned, and I said, okay, you look Chinese, you look Spanish, you look mestizo, and I just pointed out different people. I said, which one of you is the real Filipino? And they got it. They didn't see it in terms of themselves, but they thought that the real Americans were white, because they had assumed our prejudices of the 50 years before. And then the other very, the experience that I remember so clearly was in Korea. And we were speaking to various university professors and, groups like that. And this one professor said, he said, your book and this movie, he said, is nothing compared to what happens in Korea. He said, we have concentration camps, we kill people. He just went on and on to say what had happened in Korea. He says, but he says, what astounds me and what brings me to tears is that your country can send you and your husband to speak, and to speak about something that the government had apologized, and that you are able to talk about this terrible thing that the government had done. And he said, that to me is what makes America great, was that that we were able to go and speak, that the government sent us over there, and in other words, that we could wash our dirty laundry to them, and it wasn't propaganda because it was true, but we tried to make it a lesson in democracy, and so that was the other response that I'll always remember, because then you see things in a different light.
Well, and you have mentioned in that vein how important you feel for a free exchange of information within a society and really globally, because at the time people didn't really know the internment was going on, and indeed to this day I think we've talked about some people who were raised on the East Coast saying that it was really treated as kind of a local issue, sort of California news, if it was in the news at all. And so what you have said many times is that without information being freely disseminated in a society, society, really then bad things start happening again. On the other hand, we've also talked about the rise of blogging and sort of unauthoritative information being everywhere, rumor being everywhere. The internet is not the information superhighway necessarily that we thought it was going to be. It's sort of the information sewer that nobody realized was going to be, my, what a lot of nasty stuff on this. But then you see social media helping in places, like the Middle East or places where people are really trying to get their personal voice out to help with a quest for liberation and democracy.
Mm-hmm. So, well, that just shows that how important it is for each and every one of us individually to become, quote, educated, or to be able to discern when, if you're looking at the internet with this sewer of information going, to be able to make an intelligent assessment of what you're reading, and what is just propaganda and ridiculous stuff, and what may have truth to it. So in a way, I think we're living in an extraordinary time in terms of having internet and that television thing and looking at it, because all the information that is coming to us and all what we have to do to choose what information we're going to let settle and what we will work on and so forth. So it's like we have to really start developing this ability. Our brains are probably getting, especially the children, they're just having to develop a higher, what would you call it, a higher sense of intelligence, or just higher intelligence. I think this is what's happening, and it's happening fast.
Well, maybe during our Q&A, if any students here would like to tell us if they think that they're developing a higher intelligence than we have. Before actually we open it to Q&A, I'll just explain that our two staffers will be on either side of the room with microphones. Since we're taping this, we do need to have your questions on audio, okay? So you can see Felicia and Tonya, they will be positioned, and so just if you would like to ask a question, get their attention, please. They'll be be up front, please, so that people can see you, okay? Maybe one on each side? Perfect, thank you. But while they're getting into position, I did want to ask you, Mrs. Houston, the adult readers in the audience might be very interested in Mrs. Houston's novel, The Legend of Firehorse Woman. With the glare of the lights, you might not be able to see the beautiful cover. But this is a fictionalized look at a family in Manzanar, multi-generational grandmother, mother, and teenage girl, but also with a fascinating look at the grandmother coming to this country in 1902. And so it's a wonderful synthesis of the things we learn really happened to you in Farewell to Manzanar with a fictionalized account of, golly, immigration, marriage, growing up inside the camp.
Native Americans.
And
American
that's
mystique.
what I wanted to ask you about. It is mentioned in Farewell to Manzanar and very apparent in Legend of Firehorse Woman that Manzanar was built, what was it, on a burial ground?
Oh, yes. Well, not on the burial grounds, but it's a very, very interesting mile square of land. If you ever go on 395, up there in the high desert. And, geologists have, quote, dug down and they've gone through different layers of, quote, cultures or civilizations that have lived there. And, of course, way down would be the Indians. And then you have the white settlers that came to Manzanar in group, and they were the ones who planted the apple trees and the pear trees. That's what Manzanar means, the word Manzanar means. And then, of course, you have the Japanese level. So, and they're always, what's so strange about this piece of land is that it's housed people who were displaced. There's a displaced energy there. And I remember as a child in camp, there were always ghost stories about seeing Indian ghosts in the fire breaks, or seeing, but there are always Indian ghosts. They weren't ever, Civil War soldiers or anything, or white soldiers. They were Indian ghosts that seemed to roam that area. And even to this day, going there, there is this odd feeling because there's always this wind that rustles through the elder trees. It's very quiet, and there's water always trickling through there because it's the runoff from the Sierras. And one really does feel the antiquity of the land, that it has been lived on. There have been lives have, been lived there, even, beyond the 4 years that the Japanese were there. That it is a very lived-in place. And in fact, I did interview a docent from Manzanar who was a Paiute Indian. I saw an article in the paper that he would take people through Manzanar and through the area there. And he was a Paiute Indian, but he would work for the parks. So I wrote him and asked him, I said, I'd like to interview you, I'd like to talk to you to see, why you're doing this, what your connection is. So I did go to Manzanar and met him and, talked to him and interviewed him. And he's the one who gave me so much information about the Indian aspect of it. But he felt there was this karmic connection from many, many centuries back of the Japanese and the Indians, coming down from Alaska and Asia. And he used to write haiku poetry about flame. It was just astonishing.
Well, it does seem sort of parallel. As you read the novel, this strong thread in Japanese culture of listening to spirits, of acknowledging spirits, of them being, welcomed. Mm-hmm. And then also in the Native American culture, that you pay attention to what they're trying to tell you.
To nature, mm-hmm. to the land, and that it has spirits. Mm-hmm. It's very animistic. The mountain had a spirit, the rocks had spirits, the dust had spirits, everything had spirits. Japanese believe that too, for their Shinto religion. And of course the Native Americans did. Mm-hmm. So that was a very interesting, meeting of these two cultures there. Mm-hmm. In fact, I'm thinking of writing another novel about that area and planning to go in the spring and do some more research. Because I think there's a lot of ghost stories left.
Well, shall we see what the audience wants to ask you? Do you need a drink of water or anything? Let's see.
I want to congratulate you students. You've been so good sitting there and so attentively.
We appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
I didn't even see anybody texting, which is quite amazing.
It's a pleasure, and I'm glad I came this morning. My question is, I'm a child of the 60s. I'm a New Yorker, so I'm a northerner in a sense. But the African-American experience probably was very similar in the time that I tried to talk to my grandparents about their experiences during slavery, or post-slavery,
sure.
But leading through, because my great-grandfather was a slave. So I kind of look at the connection. It was difficult for them to share their experience of Jim Crow, which is a better way to describe it.
Sure.
I never really got them to really admit to some of the experiences that they had had. How were you able to get your friends and family and other interments to share their stories with you?
It was hard. Yeah, it was hard. Thank you for that question. It was very difficult because, no one likes to be, quote, a victim, and you don't want to be celebrated as a, quote, victim. That this, it makes you feel embarrassed or ashamed that you have to tell that this is how I was treated, and I think that that was it. I mean, I think that's a human response, that you don't want to talk about how you were treated as a victim. and also because it made you relive it. But I would like to say one thing right now. I think the African American experience is so unique and is so different because the African Americans were not immigrants to this country. They did not come on their own will to have a better life. They were brought here by another group. They were stolen from their countries in Africa or wherever it was and brought here against their will. So I feel, I mean, I may be totally wrong about this, but from what, in viewing about the immigrant experience as opposed to the African American experience, they're two totally different stories. And there is still so much to be told, I believe, with the African American story. And I would love to see more research going back into Africa and into that time. It doesn't have to concentrate on during the slavery era of that, because there was a time before. And it is different from the other immigration patterns that happened in this country. Although you could say that the Irish women who came as, quote, slaves, in households, remember? The Irish in Boston, young women coming to take care of children. I mean, there are all these victimizations that did go on. But, looking at our history in those terms, the immigrant terms, of what is an American, who is an American, and why are we here? I mean, it's really fascinating. Just think about it. I mean, just myself looking out into this audience, it's not a huge audience, but it's very diverse. That doesn't happen when you go to other countries. Maybe England now, in London, but not in the countryside and so forth. France, no. Just in Paris, just in the cities. Yes.
Thank you. You mentioned racism against Asians, that it spanned 100 years before Manzanar. And I want to mention that I was in Yosemite recently and was told that the Buffalo Soldiers, another group of Black Americans, protected the Asian workers who were building the Transcontinental Railroad.
Wow.
That they had to be protected because there was so much racial animosity against Asians, but we couldn't have built the railroads without the Chinese workers.
That's right.
And so I wanted you to expand a little more on, and it's a great country. I mean, I love America. I'm an American and I love this country. But I think we need to delve more, and you young people read the history because it's not always pretty, but it is history. And so I wanted you to expand a little more about the racism against Asians because, they don't know about it maybe.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And, I say 100 years ago because that's when the Asians came over. And see, they were invited over as cheap labor. It's about labor, you see. And this is when, it was because of the railroad. We were building the railroads and over. And so they needed the labor from China. And so that's when the Chinese first came over. And then they had the gold rush. And so some of the Chinese stayed in search, for gold and so forth. But it really is, in terms of, racial groups coming to the United States, it's about labor. Because think of it. This is a wide open country. We have maybe tribes of Indians around and so forth. And so if you have someone who's very wealthy, a white person, very wealthy and buys a whole bunch of land, he wants to develop something, who's he going to get to work to build the railroads, do the farms, do whatever has to be developed. So this is when companies actually went to China and gathered workers to come. And you see this is kind of a history of like Hawaii. Who's going to pick who's going to work the sugar, you know, in the plantations, so you go to another country and bring cheap labor in.
Except you don't want them to bring their wives and families, so you have the men come, right? And then you exclude them from reuniting with their families.
Right.
And you even have legislation like the Chinese Exclusion
Yeah.
Act.
That they couldn't, that they couldn't marry white, that they couldn't marry a white person. So, yes. Yeah, so when you think like that, we have come a long way, don't you think? I mean, to some extent, yes. And, but, you know, if we know about our history, and, you know, you can think of it in some way, say, oh my God, you know, how could we have thought of that? But then you can look at it too, but look at us now. See, we did make headway. We have an African-American president of the United States. I mean, that, oh my God, when I was going to college or even after that, that would have been like, are you kidding? You know, undreamed, you know. But here we do have that incredible, wonderful event. I feel like it is. My gosh. So, do any of you have any questions? You're such good students there.
Mrs. Houston loves talking to students, so.
Sometimes the most profound questions are asked by young students.
Good morning. Somehow I missed this book and the TV series, and I don't know how, but I have been to Manzanar. That trip up 395 to going to Mammoth every year. So I was studying the map, and I saw that, and we stopped. And you're absolutely right about that feeling when you walk through there. And I didn't know what it was until you spoke this morning. But it wasn't necessarily eerie, but there was this feeling as you walk through the grounds there. So getting this book is something that I definitely plan to do. My question was, my son at the time was around 6 years old when we walked the grounds. And I noticed him running and playing and hopping. The children at the time, I want to know about, were they well aware of what was going on, or were they really just being kids like kids are, playing, laughing, doing games? I wondered about how the children fared through that.
Well, you know, I can only say about my own experience because I was 7 years old when we went to camp. And I remember going into camp and saying, oh, this is a camp? I mean, I was filled with excitement because all of our family were in the same bus. And I had no idea of the concept of war or, you know, or why we were there. And I do remember this, and I have written about this aspect of it, is that once I asked my mother, I said, you know, why are we in this prison camp? I mean, you know, because we soon became aware that we couldn't go outside the barbed wire. So we were in this encampment. So I said, why are we in this prison camp? And my mother, you know, knowing that I was too young to know about war, politics, etc., said to me, it's because we're Japanese. So from that, I realized in my later work, it was from that very moment that she told me that we were in a prison because of being Japanese, that I realized that it was not only bad to be Japanese, it was criminal. So I grew up with a real shame, or that somehow being Japanese was so bad. And I had, you know, it took years to even get to the point where I understood where it came from. This feeling of, you know, I mean, I know all of us have feelings of self-worth or lack of self-worth and so forth, but having it coupled with being the very person you are, you know, because that you can be imprisoned for that, took a lot of work to get beyond that. And for children, we had fun in camp. We just, for the first time, were totally unsupervised. We didn't have a school for a year or so. We just, ran around in camp, and caught snakes or whatever it was and played with rocks. We had to make our own toys and so forth. So my memories of, being that age are not like horrific or like, oh, it was a terrible time, and food was bad or something like that. But I do remember one of the, things that stick in my mind was when my, not sister-in-law, but she was a relative, died in Manzanar, in the hospital. She had a miscarriage, and of course, probably there weren't that many good doctors there, so she died, and there was this funeral. I remember that first funeral I ever went to. And all the flowers were made from crepe paper. Everybody in the block made these beautiful flowers because there were no flowers, for wreaths and how the Japanese do. That was a very powerful experience, and that instant of realizing that people die. And there, having my tonsils out, the first time ever being away from home and being in the hospital. They did have a hospital. They were taking out all the kids' tonsils, So strange little remembrances that way.
Well, I guess as time went on in the camp, they instituted things like Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts and little dance bands. And
I didn't think there were any Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts. No. I didn't see any Scouts. There probably were, but then I was too young to be aware of that. But oh yes, because there's nothing to do in camp. So people who were dancers started teaching kids or anybody to dance. If somebody was Ikebana person, because they would just volunteer to have activities to do this. And I took ballet from somebody. I took tap dancing from two very good brothers who were great tap dancers. Japanese loved tap dancing during that era. And
little known fact.
Yeah, and so we just had to keep ourselves, quote, occupied, and then we did have a school. And we had the best teachers, because the teachers came from the federal government. So we had teachers who were terrific, and I remember by the time I got out of camp, I was way ahead of the grades outside. So I'm remembering those things from a child's point of view. So if you talk to my older brothers and sisters, they probably would have a different story.
Yes.
How long did that feeling stay with you that it was bad to be Japanese, and how did you get over it? Was writing the book part of getting over it, or did it happen before that?
Writing the book. I wasn't even really that aware of it. I mean, it took me that long. I was, 38 years old before that. But that was the 60s and 70s. That's when people were looking further, at themselves and at ethnic minorities. And in fact, it was the first time that ethnic minorities themselves began to look at their own history and see it as meaningful and so forth. But until then, you just wanted to be as Anglo-Saxon as you could possibly be. You wanted to be white because there was no, other model to look at. And that's what really, it really was Martin Luther King. He began the whole transformation of consciousness in this country regarding race and who's an American. I really, truly believe that. That's when it began. Ooh, there's so many hands.
Felicia's getting the work out today.
I have a question about the property. that your father owned, was that confiscated? And any property, Terminal Island, what happened with the court case that you were to be remunerated for that property?
Yeah, that's the tragedy of that. And so this is what happened. You know, if you owned a house, I mean, the bank owned it, right? Part of it. So you're making payments. So if you're incarcerated, you can't make payments. So the house, that's how you lose your property. And in some cases, because of the Land Law Act, the parents put the name into somebody else's name. I mean, it could even be a neighbor or their child, you know, because the child was an American citizen, or they were so afraid of what would happen, they would just give their deed to a neighbor or someone else to take care of it. And some of the people did, but others, you know, just sold it because it was scary. I mean, you just wanted to leave. You didn't want to go back. You know, so many people left and stayed in Iowa and Missouri and Arkansas, you know, that they were incarcerated at. So that's how the property was lost. They couldn't pay the money anymore, you know, couldn't pay your mortgages, and you just gave it up. And your cars, definitely, that's what you do. I think what my parents did is my mother had a beautiful silver, and because it was just over their 35th wedding anniversary, and they had a big, you know, all kinds of china and gifts. And I think what they did, is they packed it up and they just left it in the cellar.
I heard the story. I heard the story that I think it was in East LA, where the neighbor collected rent of the house of his Japanese neighbor and banked it. And then when they returned, he gave them the money that he had.
Oh, yes,
in
there
their
were many
bank account.
stories. Many stories like that of really wonderful. I wish there was a whole book of those people who did that, those generous and human acts of taking care of the Japanese you know, their property or their money when they left. There are many opposite things that happen, you know, just in the Central Valley,
Yes.
because that's where the big farms were.
Yeah. There is a novel called Southland by Nina Revoir. Have you
Oh,
seen
you
that?
know, I know of the book, but I haven't read it.
Yeah, that is very specifically a fictionalized version of real events in the Crenshaw district of African American neighbors watching out for their Japanese American
Oh,
neighbors who were
really?
interned.
Oh,
Yeah.
beautiful.
It's a wonderful book. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Did we have some over here? Yes.
Thank you so much for pointing out the similarity and the parity with the American Indian. I had failed to recognize that, and being an American Indian, I'm particularly sad about that. But it just goes to show in my mind that really all cultures have a great deal of similarity. And if you look at one, you look at another, you can always find a lot in common. Would you speak to the indignity of the 48-hour removal and what your family and your friends had to go through in that small, very shallow period of time?
Well, you know, I was such a child then, but I think what I remember, I mean, I can't remember the logistics, you know, about moving and so forth, except with my mother's fear, because they had taken my father away. So she and my oldest brother were the ones, you know, trying to keep the family together and, you know, not knowing what's going to happen. And her fear was that the family would break up. Some of them were married, and she was trying to keep us together. And as far as, you know, your property or, you know, I think when something like that happens, that goes out the window. You're thinking of your own safety and about survival. You say, well, okay, because it's a first in history. I mean, we never heard of anything like that, happening in America. And let's face it, I mean, I never like to put the Holocaust and the internment in the same breath, but it wasn't until after the war that we learned in America what had happened in Europe. So you see, and now we know, but at that time, you didn't. One didn't have any idea of what might happen. So if you put yourself in that place, and you already have experienced racist, feelings. My father never went into a Caucasian restaurant in his life because he was so proud and so embarrassed that he would not be served. Yes, I mean, that was in my father's generation. So, they had a different code that they lived by. So it was so different after the 60s. And I can say, so different. And again, I just want to reiterate that it was Martin Luther King's leadership that turned this country to seeing, who we really are and what all the race groups and all the cultural groups have given to this country to make it what it is. We didn't look at it that way.
Now, your father didn't know that you married Jim, right?
No. In my family, I'm the only one that married outside of the Japanese race, except my sister. But she married much later, after Jim and I were married. I have one sister. The nieces and nephews are all intermarriaged, but not in my family. Mm-hmm. No, he would probably be very upset.
Yes.
Did you ever want to leave America and go live in Japan?
Did I ever want to leave Manzanar and go to Japan?
Leave America.
Oh, did I ever want to leave America and go to Japan after this happened? Well, no, I never wanted to leave America. That never occurred to me. And I did go to Japan. I wanted to see what Japan was like. But I never felt like Japan was my country, because it wasn't. America was. And when I did go to Japan, I really realized how different I was from, the Japanese in Japan. And they, as soon as they saw me get off the plane and go up to the, where you check in with the passport, I had practiced the, very polite phrase to say in Japanese. I was there on a scholarship, like a fellowship for 6 months. So I learned a little bit of Japanese since I went up there. And I said, in the most polite way, Japanese way I could, to the young men taking the passports, I am American, da-da-da-da, in Japanese. And he looked at me, he said, yes. He said, I know you're an American. He just had to look at me, the way I walked, everything.
Hi. I've always wanted to meet you ever since I learned that you live in Santa Cruz, because I was born and raised there on the west side. So I always felt like you were a neighbor. But growing up there, given the demographics, I get what you mean about wanting to assimilate or to be white. When I was much younger, I would be the only African American in class, and but then I outgrew that, of course, as you get older and you learn. And I'm curious, because you were mentioning your husband and the biracial relationship. How did that help you? Because I'm sure it was a struggle. How did it help you begin to love yourself as a Japanese American, or to really grow into a security in that?
Well, Thank you so much for that question. And also, what is your name?
My name is Alex Robinson.
Alex Robinson, and you're from Santa Cruz? Oh, well, nice to see you. And do you teach here or something?
I do, yes. I teach at Morningside High School.
Oh,
But I was born and raised in Santa Cruz and grew up there. And
Did you go to UC Santa Cruz?
actually, I came down here because I stayed in Santa Cruz and I wanted a change of pace. But I love it. I miss it. I was just there for spring break. My relatives are there, so I think I might go back. I'm not sure. I like LA too.
Oh, please do. Well, as to your question about, you mean my own, quote, psychological journey to, I do, I think that when I married Jim, now going back to this, part of it was for protection. And actually, I remember saying to my father had passed away because he probably would have just been, horribly upset. But I said to my mother that, Jim had asked me to marry him and da-da-da-da-da-da. And she said, well, because I was wanting to see what her reaction would be. And she said, I think that's a good idea. He said, the very fact that he is, quote, going against society and maybe even his family in marrying out of his race, marrying you, means that he's a strong man. He says, and that's what you will need, a strong man to protect you in this country. That's what my mother told me. I mean, that was pretty wise, wasn't it? That she wanted me to be protected, and she figured that if Jim could go out of his comfort life and, be my husband, that she said he was strong. And that's what she wanted for me. And, it's true. He had very strong opinions, and, he lived by what he believed in. So I think that he definitely, before marrying him, I was the wannabe American, except I didn't have blonde hair and blue eyes. But I really I was a majorette, I was a song girl, I was smart in all the classes, I was just fit in those days, what every young girl wanted to do. But by the time I got together with Jim, that changed, and I think I became, and actually with the writing of Farewell to Manzanar too, I really, refound my roots, so to speak, and pride in it. Although before that, I always seemed to work, with juvenile delinquents. I was a probation officer, and I always worked in a field where I wanted to help others. And then I realized that later that this came from my own feeling of, of being left out myself because of, my race.
All of my grandparents were foreign-born, but Caucasians coming into a majority Caucasian country didn't have that much of a problem. There was prejudice against the immigrants, but that's everywhere except in my hometown, which was a mining community, so labor was welcome, and it was a little United Nations. Everybody knew they were the best, and everybody else was a step down, and we all got along wonderfully. But what I don't understand, going back to a comment that you made, when I was in the Army, one of the Japanese guys in my barracks was American-born, he was Nisei, was feeling slightly not American, and I think wanted to go back to Japan, but in Japan he was slightly not Japanese. So he never fit in, and I lost contact with him, as did a good friend with whom I'm still in contact, and we were all three friends. My comment is, of the people who are having real problems, which my grandparents did not, of the people who are having problems, why did they not go back? Did they feel stuck here, or were they still hopeful, or were they embarrassed to go back? And did any of the people you interviewed ever answer that question to you?
Well, I think that, I didn't interview very many Issei. One, couldn't speak Japanese that well. But I think that the common denominator would be, yes, there are all these difficulties here, and I think this would be in every immigrant group, but it's still better than it was in the old country. It would still be harder to be in the old country. It was hard here, but it was still better. I think, I think if all of us, all of you who had grandparents, great-grandparents who came from another country, that would be their reaction too, even though they didn't make a million like the Rockefellers and so forth. Their life was still, had more freedom, and there was still open space that they could go or, travel to, go west, or could buy land and so forth. Whereas Europe, was pretty much, thousands of years and centuries of, tradition and already owned within families and so forth. So I'm not saying one's bad and one's good, but I think the American spirit, because we did have space, because we do have this spirit of, quote, independence, and freedom is such a big thing. That's the number one value that, if I ask any of the students, what does it mean to be an American, and what is it in the Constitution, that you love? And it's always freedom.
Thank you.
Does that answer that?
It does. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kiara. I go to St. John, and my question is, have you ever felt like you were out of place, like you didn't belong?
I couldn't understand.
Have you ever felt like you were out of place, like you didn't belong in America?
Did I ever feel like I was out of place and that I didn't belong? Yes. When I was young? Oh, all the time. Until I just felt I had to be better. I had to, really be smart in school, and if I was going to try out for majorette, I really had to be good. In other words, I had to try harder.
Well, I think, too, what's so interesting for many of us as women reading Farewell to Manzanar, the passages in which Mrs. Houston talks about simultaneously needing to be exceptional and wanting to be invisible.
Right. Oh yeah, I definitely had that. What would you call it? Kind of schizophrenic thing, I just would just like to, but another part of me said, no, go in there and fight for it, and so forth, but it's just too painful. Like that one part in the book, in Farewell to Manzanar, when they vote me queen at the high school, and I wore this sarong, because I had a flower in my hair and my long hair. I knew that would get him. And of course it did, because, boy, that's so sexy and romantic and everything. But when I did become queen, I thought, oh my God, now I have to be respectful, and what kind of dress am I going to wear, for the evening gown type thing. And so I was in great conflict after that, because then it was like, oh, well, you have to be sedate, and especially my mother said, oh, you can't wear a strapless, and so forth. So it was, when I think of it now, going through that time, I didn't know how I managed to maneuver through it, but I did.
Well, it's so amazing to us to think of not allowing an Asian cheerleader, or what was it, a drum majorette?
Oh, yeah. There were so many things that I could not belong to a sorority.
Yeah.
I could not belong to the Girl Scouts. I could not, none of the socially were open to, not just me, but Asians, African Americans, Latinos, anybody who was not of color. Who was of color, except at Long Beach at the time, some of our best athletes were Latinos, and they were in a couple of the fraternities.
We have time for a couple more. Oh, good.
Okay. Before I ask my question, I want to mention the library took some of the money from Cal Humanities and from California Center for the Book and bought multiple copies of your book. And they're categorized as young adult, and I saw we still had several available at the beginning of the week in the children's room. But the question is, most of us have never heard of any camps other than Manzanar. And you mentioned the existence of others. Is it because of your book that we don't know the others, or is it that Manzanar was the largest and central location?
Well, I think it could be both. I mean, this is my own opinion, is that some of the, where the camps were, I mean, there's just nothing in existence. I mean, you know, you wouldn't know there was a camp there. But because Manzanar, because it was a political group, Sue Embry and some wonderful people who were detained in camp and who fought to have it become a national park. You know, that's why Manzanar is remembered, because they had pilgrimages. I think we really owe this to Sue Embry and her group that would start having these pilgrimages to Manzanar. And then actually it became a park, you know, a part of the national parks. So you do have Minidoka is just now starting to have a sign up there. Poston, I don't know, they may have a sign someplace, or maybe I don't know about Amachi or Utah. You know, they would just be a little sign, but nothing to the extent of Manzanar. And I do believe Heart Mountain now is developing, you know, like a kiosk or something to indicate that this is where one of the camps were. But it's under the jurisdiction of the national parks system now. And Manzanar is really highly, highly developed. You know, they have a museum. They could have books, photographs, and it's an odd thing when you think of it, you know. I mean, an odd thing that is just, you know, preserved that way.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, we have a student question, Tonya. Thanks a lot.
What did you and your family do when Manzanar was over? After Manzanar? What did you and your family do?
What did myself and my family do?
After Manzanar?
Oh, after Manzanar. Well, you know, that's another thing that I mentioned in the book, because it seems like before the war and after the war, because before the war we were a very tight family. Well, actually, it would have, you know, we would have broken up anyway, because my sisters and brothers would have gotten married and started their own families. But it just seemed like after Manzanar, that's when, you know, the family just kind of disintegrated and it became smaller, just became my father and the younger ones. So we, you know, there was a great housing shortage in California during the war and after the war. So here we have these thousands of Japanese Americans. Where are they going to be put? You know, some went to Seabrook, New Jersey, some went to Minnesota and Ohio, and you know, they went to different places of the state, but many had to go back to Long Beach or Gardena or wherever they had lived before. Well, Long Beach, we lived in San Pedro before that, and Terminal Island was destroyed. So there no longer was this little Japanese fishing ghetto there. But they did have defense housing projects that came up during the war. Now, a defense housing project are these like projects. Do you have projects here in LA now, like you do in San Francisco? Project housing? Yeah. Okay. Well, in Long Beach, they built these, they call it Cabrillo Homes, Truman Boyd Manor, and these were defense housing projects during the war that people came from all over the states to work in the automotive, the defense plants. So after the war, many of these people went back to North Carolina, Ohio, wherever they came from. So there were these empty defense project homes, and that's where they put many of the Japanese. And that's where we went, to a defense housing project in Long Beach. But most people didn't have homes anymore. They went to trailer camps.
was your husband's family reaction to you marrying him?
Well, it's really interesting. Jim said that because he grew up in San Francisco, and he remembers as a child that they would pass Tanforan, which is the racing grounds, and at that time they had Japanese in there before they would transfer them to Tule Lake or other camps. And he says he remembered as a child going by, and he would see kids, at the bar looking out. And he said he remembered looking in there. I said, yeah, too bad I wasn't in there. That would have really been ironic if I saw you, But, and he said he saw that, and he asked his parents what that was, and they never answered him. They just drove quietly by. So he never knew about the camps.
Oh. Well, did people know that they were these staging areas where then people were, going out to the camps?
I think that people just didn't know.
Yeah.
You have to remember there was no television in those days. So you wouldn't have, reporters interviewing old ladies and children as they go into these camps. There was no television, so you didn't have that everyday reportage, so forth. So it was essentially journalism, or, it was the Hearst newspapers that reported this, and they were not always fair.
No.
Yeah. So, I think a lot of people had no idea what that was unless they were there and they just looked in. They said, "Wow, who's that?"
Yeah.
So
I guess they used a lot of race courses for some
They
reason.
did,
Right?
and
Doesn't Santa Anita
fairgrounds.
also fairgrounds?
Fairgrounds and Salinas and Fresno, they just went. I mean, it's amazing because do you remember something happened in Los Angeles, and there was a huge, not like a riot, but an uprising, students and so forth, and the police rounded them up and put them in the Coliseum for a weekend. Do you remember that, anybody? See, I can't even remember what the issue was, but it was a long time ago. And these students and people who were rioting or whatever it was and put into the Coliseum for the weekend. And boy, they sued the government after that. I don't know how many people were there. And they had to pay them each person $10,000 for a weekend of internment. So, of just without, any habeas corpus, is that the word?
Due process, right.
They just sent it in there and they were just sued after that. So when you think that, for the Japanese Americans who were interned for years, 3 years, 2 years, and who did finally, quote, sue the government about this wrongful act, that the recompense, was that they did apologize, the government did apologize, and pay back the remaining living internees $20,000 per person. Right, so if you compare that, but of course, at that point, there weren't that many left. But these are lessons that we must learn and we must not forget. I mean, I'm not up here to say, oh, this is terrible and all this, because you, as young kids, I know that this sounds, really, ooh, is up there, but someday you're going to remember this. You're going to remember this, and there are always going to be some kind of civil action or some kind of, but our country will be going to, because that is what our country does, because, we allow this type of thing. Just remember that.
Well,
that you prevail.
That you prevail.
Yes.
Well, okay, so we have time for one more. Do you have voice for one more question? Wait 1 sec. The mic is on its way. Oh. There we go.
I just wanted to encourage everybody to go to the Japanese-American Museum, and then you can learn all about all about this internment all over the country. It's all there documented.
Thank you. And do they still have the recreation of the barracks?
Yeah, that's there.
Yeah, if you want to see the actual space that Mrs. Houston and her family lived in, recreation of it right there. Thank you. Excellent plug. Okay, one more. Now one more.
You spoke earlier about newspapers and their coverage. At the Special Collections Library at UCLA, they have a focus on propaganda. And during the time, the Herald Examiner, the Los Angeles Times, they more so sided, with the government and the idea that Japanese Americans were removed for protection. But Charlotta Bass, who was publisher of the African American newspaper California Eagle, she devoted a lot of time and a lot of front page energy for her newspaper, speaking out and on the behalf of Japanese Americans and why the internment was wrong. And I know earlier you said, you gave a lot of credit to Dr. King later and the movement, but I also would like you to know that Charlotta Bass spent a lot of time and probably a lot of it had to do with Jim Crow segregation and her coming from the South. And she used her newspaper as a platform. Mm-hmm. And all those things are documented at the Special Collections at UCLA.
Thank you. Yes. Yes.
I think that's a good place to stop on an inspirational note that this information is out there and accessible, and we have heroes all around us in every age. Will you help me to thank Mrs. Houston for being here today? Thank you all.
Thank you, too.